some final thoughts of you about this election and what's ahead before we wrap up the show tonight. But I'd sort of like to begin the discussion there, here about 10 minutes before the end of our program, taking a bit of an opportunity to step back and reflect on this election season in general. It's close to 10 p.m. Pacific time. It's almost 1 a.m. at the White House. So with the exception of the next week or two as final ballots are counted, this election cycle is coming to an end, and unprecedented in many ways, surely in terms of misinformation, disinformation, to the way the national media has covered this, the behavior of candidates, COVID-19 being the topic that dominated discourse. And joining me for a discussion about all of these things and what's next, a couple of great researchers here on the Washington State University campus. Paul Bowles, who's the Associate Dean of Research at the Murrow College, as well as Jordan Foley, an assistant professor whose research includes the flow of political information through the digital space. Gentlemen, I know you've been watching tonight's counts closely and really this whole election season. Thank you both for being here tonight. Now, we've tabbed both of you as our social scientists here. And really what I want to dig into is the political discourse. How are we interacting with one another? What, with the news we read, with the way our expectations of candidate behavior are evolving? Mr. Foley, I sort of want to talk to you with that because there's so many things that go into how we interact with news media during an election cycle.
Absolutely. People come into contact with political information in ways that we typically don't expect. I think people like myself and perhaps people who are involved in journalism tend to think of people as more engaged in politics than they really are. And I think it's really important for us not only to communicate, sort of to help inform people about how to react to uncertain situations like this in elections that have such a decentralized administrative process and are difficult to navigate even for people within their own state, let alone able to sort of make sense of everything that's happening in a bunch of different states as well. And so it's important, I think, for journalists in particular, when they're thinking about writing stories and sort of what the impact of those can be, that it's really important to center the voter as sort of the protagonist in the story. That oftentimes we see these really emotive, conflict-based, newsworthy stories about political elites sort of going at one another over an outcome like an election or a piece of legislation or something like that. And I think that ends up driving an emotional process that I think is really rooted in a form of partisanship that we really need to be attentive to. And that I think both as people are navigating their information environment to be able to identify when those things are happening, in the articles that they're reading, or even being able to reflect on their own personal biases as they're navigating this information abundance is crucially important, especially at a time like this.
And you mentioned the word emotion. And at the risk of making this sound like a science discussion, we'll bring in Mr. Bowles. I want to introduce our audience to a word you taught me, neuropolitics. So this is an area of study for you. What is neuropolitics, and how have you applied this to 2020?
So it's been fascinating for me as a social scientist to working in this whole area of neuropolitics, which, to put it in a nutshell, is simply the science of the human brain on political information, looking at how we process politics and how politics influences the way we emotionally process information, including making decisions around elections. And so the science that I've been so privileged to get to do has really dug into the underlying brain processes that drive this just fascinating, confounding, and honestly somewhat disturbing emotional environment that we're in with our political discourse. For instance, I've had the opportunity to use this methodology to conduct a test with some industry partners on the last presidential debate. And using a measure called skin conductance, which is an unconscious measure of how intense an emotional response is, we were able to look at patterns of Trump supporters, Biden supporters, and undecided voters, and found some really interesting patterns in the emotional responses of Trump supporters compared to the other groups, in that they were a lot more intense in their emotional responses pretty much across the board. And what's really interesting about that finding is that lines up with some research that a colleague at Texas Tech, Eric Busey, and I did on the 2016 election that showed that Donald Trump really does perform very well at energizing this base emotionally and driving responses. And I think that's a phenomenon that has really been introduced into our political environment. And if we step back from that for a minute, I think it's important to look at how to deal with that positively and productively.
It's very interesting activating the emotional response. In fact, a little bit of data maybe to back that up, and I'll turn our attention to Mr. Foley as well. And sorry, we're getting close to our time, so I'll ask you to make this about 30 seconds. But we did see a survey that suggested about 70% of voters feel the country would be irreparably damaged if the other candidate won. Can you assess this sort of belief from a reality versus rhetoric point of view?
Yeah, I think political discourse generally, and certainly in the coverage of it in news media, certainly tends to reflect this sort of teamsmanship, sort of almost as you would expect from allegiances to sports teams in terms of how they want to sort of see the other side. And when you're engaged in that contest, it's really easy to come to really fatalistic conclusions about the nature of that particular outcome. And I think that, in some cases, that's not necessarily to say that there aren't outcomes that we should be concerned about. And even if our preferred candidate wins, there are certainly problems that we really want to focus on, and that I think that it's important that we turn our attention to what those issues are and exactly how we can sort of approach sort of resolving some of those issues. And one thing that I think a lot of this election sort of demonstrates is that politicians and people who are engaged in this process, and Trump in particular, is very, very good at playing to the newsworthiness tendencies of journalists, and that we know from research that coverage of the 2016 election tended to focus on that candidate much more and tended to cover him in ways that was more effective at sort of reaching, as Dr. Bowles mentions, that sort of emotional, energizing base, and that there certainly needs to be a lot of calibration, certainly within the political parties about this. But I think it's just so important for people to be critically reflexive about the way that people are attempting to appeal to those things in the process of making decisions and how they eventually vote and participate in the electoral process.
It's fascinating stuff, Mr. Bowles, Mr. Foley. I could probably talk to you for an hour on this subject, but we do have parameters to hit here. We really appreciate your time and perspective here tonight.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
And just a few minutes left in our show. I want to bring